if we are blaming others, we become blind to seeing our own self. We lose the ability to have a true picture of our own self. And so he actually, I think, compared it to dust, that when you detract others, criticize others, even if it's just, even if it's true, still it's like blowing into a pile of dust and it gets in your own eyes. And then you do lose your ability to see the truth.
Before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, you might want to check out more at optimwork.com. Our website offers unique content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond. We have an in-depth masterclass covering our entire theory of growth, daily recommendations for personalized advice, and a platform to help groups and organizations learn and practice optimal work together. You can get a free trial at optimwork.com. Now let's start the episode. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of the Optimal Work Podcast, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, Kevin. Well, I thought, I'm not sure actually if we've ever discussed this figure on the podcast before, but I thought we could discuss some of his work because it's extremely popular, and a lot of people say that it's very, very closely related to what we talk about. And so the author in question is Jocko Willink. And his book, Extreme Ownership in particular, which came out a number of years ago. So Kevin, wonder if you're up for speaking about that.
Yeah, Jocko is an example of someone who it's the kind of book I like to read, not because of all the military stories, which I don't know, I guess that's, some people love military stories.
He's a former Navy SEAL.
He's a Navy SEAL commander, and but what I really like about the book is that there is a sense of mastery, like a kind of like a master clinician writing a book on how to help people. So there's just so much practical wisdom all the way through, and you know that these ideas have been tested in real life again and again, and it just shows. And so he's not citing the literature all over the place, although he could have. There's actually a good deal of literature in management theory supporting what he's talking about. But he just gives you a nice, clear, operational theory of how to grow, particularly in situations where it's not exactly clear how to move forward. So that's what I liked about it.
Awesome. Well, Kevin, so I just have a kind of background question. I'm curious because it seems like in the military, people would be very interested in psychology and helping people deal with stressful situations. Mm-hmm. And there would have been a certain amount of expertise that comes out of that. You clearly see that in the case of Jocko. Also, I think maybe it's good to mention that there is a co-author of this book, Leif Babin, who also deserves credit for his good work.
Yep. Another Navy SEALs commander. Yeah.
Right. I guess my question is there has there historically been a relationship between the military and the learnings from dealing with stressful situations in the military applied to everyday psychology or the work of psychiatrists? Basically, what Jocko Willink is trying to do here is he like the first one to really try to do that, or is there more of a precedent for that?
There has been a kind of silo between the expertise that the military has and clinical psychology as a whole. And I think maybe in the last 15 years, that has been breaking down, which is a good thing. For instance, the military, and Jocko talks about these themes, has known for a long time how to handle anxiety, how to get people ready for battle. And when you hear the things that Jocko says about this, people can look up on YouTube or wherever him talking about how to prepare yourself for stressful situations. I think that now it makes perfect sense, given the developments of psychology, that you could say, oh yeah, but I feel like we could have saved a lot of time and gotten to a better place, what I call the gold age, which is really seeing all the positive benefits of adrenaline. And it's just a sign your body is getting you ready for battle, is what he would say. And so you should be happy when you get nauseous before a big event, because it means that your body is diverting blood from your stomach to your brain so you can perform better. Well, all of that I love. It's good. But there wasn't much, you didn't hear about this like 20 years ago. I think the military has put a lot into the study of PTSD, and you see that with the VA system. And so the VA system in the US has become, Veterans Administration system has become a big source now of psychological studies. And so, but it's interesting that that isn't necessarily leveraging the practical know-how that the soldiers have. And how to overcome these things and how they teach each other. So I like to think that what you see in Jocko in writing a book like this and his other books on discipline and so on is making the practical wisdom that the military has gained over centuries more accessible to a psychologically informed audience.
Mm-hmm.
Or to everyone. But it's interesting for us who are psychologically informed, because then you can see that there's a great solidity to so much of what he says.
Yeah. And here in this book, he's applying it in particular in the business context. Mm-hmm. So I think it'll be helpful for us to unpack a little bit his approach. And then maybe we can also talk about, are there deeper insights there that would apply to everyone, not just in the business context? And I think there are. So maybe, Kevin, you could just briefly explain his main approach, extreme ownership.
Yeah, maybe an example is good, and just to show people how he goes about this. And actually, this is a story about Leif, who he does consulting work with. And they tell the story in the book of Gary, who is a mid-level manager in a company, and he had given very explicit instructions to this one superintendent, telling him the circumstances in which the superintendent had to consult him, Gary, and couldn't just make calls on his own. But the superintendent, some kind of drilling process, basically blew him off. It was like, whatever. Like, I know a heck of a lot more about this than you do. And just ignored him. And the superintendent went on to make a call on his own without consulting Gary. And it was the wrong call. And there is delays that cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so Gary was pulling his hair out. And so he calls up Leif and says, what am I going to do? Because if I confront this guy on his bad behavior, he could easily leave. And he has so much experience that he'd be hired by a competitor right away. And so that's the conundrum. And I love how Leif dealt with it. And let me just read to you what Leif told this guy, Gary, that he has to say. Here's what you need to say. Our team made a mistake, and it's my fault. It's my fault because I wasn't as clear as I should have been in explaining why we have these procedures in place and how not following them could cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. You're an extremely skilled and knowledgeable superintendent. You know more about the business than I ever will. It was up to me to make sure that you know the parameters we have to work within and why some decisions have to be run through me. Now I have to fix this situation so that it doesn't happen again. So I think that's actually a brilliant way of handling it. That the superintendent is not lying. He's not trying to say something that he doesn't believe in. And in the book, there's a little bit back and forth, and Leif helps him to get on board with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the manager.
The manager, yeah. He helps Gary to get on board. Because it's natural that when things go bad, we want to blame people. And it even might be that there's a lot of truth in blaming. In this case, the superintendent really should have consulted, and he made the wrong call. But even that, because Gary is the leader of the team, it was Gary's responsibility to make sure that all of those parameters are communicated. And what a wonderful modeling it does. To see, I'm eager to learn. I just want to improve. Gary kind of has to check his ego at the door and say, this is not about my ego. It's about the mission of the company. It's about the common good. And I'm really interested just in the common good, which is in that case, the company. So what can we do to make sure then that this doesn't happen in the future? I think that the superintendent, who is unnamed, would very likely go along with that. No one wants to feel like he's getting blamed. And this idea that a leader needs to own, the outcomes and to see in them what he can learn or she can learn about how to improve their own performance. And I think that's a beautiful lesson. And so many times in my practice, I see the mischief caused in families and companies by people not taking responsibility where they need to.
Mm-hmm. So, Kevin, I think this is a great idea of, it kind of, you get the idea of why the book is called Extreme Ownership and the name for the central idea there. Now, when you're thinking about mentoring people, I get the sense that you wouldn't have, and maybe this example is a little bit condensed for presentation in the book or in the podcast, but it seems like Leif went straight to, here's what you should do, here's what you have to say. So I'm wondering how in that situation, how does that approach of extreme ownership fit in with reframing, which you probably, if you were, mentoring or coaching that person, you probably would have first helped him or, helped Gary rather to reframe the situation and take a new view. So in the context of kind of taking ownership when other people make mistakes that you are in a sense responsible for, how do you first reframe that difficulty to then pair that with, okay, I'm going to take ownership and take action?
Yeah, I think I would have been focused first on what's the real challenge here. So, and it seems like the real challenge Gary had was his anger at the supervisor. And he was angry because the supervisor showed contempt for him. And that contempt ended up costing the company money. But, anger is really good at showing us where problems are. It is really bad at showing us how to address those problems. And anger, it makes it so easy for us to blame others. And so I think that if he could have owned the kind of the sense of shame and anger that he was feeling, at this, it would have been, I think, easier for him to see then how those feelings could actually bring out his best response. And his best response is going to go directly against them. So, and it's going to be leaning into the challenge. Because if you take responsibility, and in this case, as a leader, that's what he rightly should do, that is going to cause a momentary flaring of the sense of unfairness and shame and these mixed emotions that he has, about the superintendent. Well, I would want him to get used to that feeling. That in the future, when these things come up, they can be a nice signal for him that, this is one of those times. How do I, instead of acting on my anger, and punishing him, how do I act instead? But that said, so I would want him to use this to grow in his ability to put his finger on what the real difficulty is. So in this example, Leif, I think, had this intuitive sense that the real difficulty is that he was angry at the superintendent for showing him contempt. But he didn't specify that so directly. Instead, he just went for what would be a practical step that would improve the relationship between these two men. And in this case, the Gary taking responsibility and asking to see, how could we make sure this doesn't happen in the future, would get you to the best end. So I don't know, I think it's a great question, Sharif. The reframe, if there is one in the book, it's implicit maybe, but it's not explicit.
Before we continue, a brief message. If you're benefiting from these discussions, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Doing so helps us to reach more people. So you're not just learning, you're also helping others to discover a path of growth and flourishing. Thanks for your support. So I guess you could say extreme ownership is kind of giving people an ideal to strive for.
Yeah.
It's like a pattern for how they can act. So my next question is, well, we talk a lot about, we have many podcast episodes where this has been brought up, the idea of active challenge versus passive challenge, and that when you're challenged, rather than seeing it as something external, something being forced upon you that you just have to bear, that you try to see it, how can I challenge myself to
Yeah.
do better in this situation? So make it active. So is extreme ownership basically the same idea as just flipping from passive challenge to active challenge? Or is there
Hmm.
something else going on here?
I think that probably is. Again, I'd have to say, I think that the idea of what it means to own the situation is getting to the point where you can actively challenge yourself. So, in some ways, extreme ownership is the prerequisite for active challenge. It's not necessarily the substance of it. And they, in fact, extreme ownership, the way they think of it, isn't the whole story. Because the other half of the story is what they call decentralized command, which you could think of as decentralized ownership. And so, really, you take responsibility for all that you can, but you also help others to take responsibility so that they also can grow. Because if you just never gave people the chance to grow by never taking responsibility, you wouldn't be doing them any service. So I think when we're talking about, am I actively challenging myself in this situation? The fact that we're using ideals and bonds as the real way to challenge oneself, I think it makes it not needing to be so balanced and hedged. It's like, no, it actually works in every circumstance. When you can really see how an ideal gives you a chance to stretch yourself in a situation, then you have the best source of motivation for doing it. So I feel like, so I don't know, so maybe that's part of it. But certainly in the end, you cannot grow unless you are actively challenging yourself. The other thing that is really key is if you're blaming others for your unhappiness or your lack of success or whatever is not right in your life, to the extent that you're blaming others, you are not going to be locating where you can grow. Now, it doesn't mean others aren't in some ways to blame, but that doesn't help you to grow. It's not about it's not about the establishing the objective level of percent of blame between you and someone else for something. It's only at locating what can you change. And you can only change those areas where your growth lies. So that actually gives you this great sense of freedom from otherwise feeling oppressed by circumstances, which is where you end up if you're blaming others. Passive challenge is a prison state. It means that you feel like there's nothing you can do because these challenges are just being imposed on you from outside. You're just being challenged by all these bad actors. Well, as long as you're in that role of the victim, you're not actually exercising any agency. You will not feel free. You'll feel like you're imprisoned actually by the circumstances and people in your life, or by the conditions you have, or it's whatever it might be. Blaming people or conditions or circumstances limits growth.
Kevin, would that be the way that you would help people to apply this idea of extreme ownership? I guess the first thing you need to do is identify when you need to apply it. It's like, okay, I'm in a situation now, extreme ownership. I need to take extreme ownership. And the trigger for that is when you find that you're blaming someone, that would be to you the trigger that, okay, I'm not taking extreme ownership and I need to flip.
Yeah. I think that blaming others is such a sensitive indicator, of this loss of ownership, the loss of agency, loss of freedom, however you want to say it. So there's this ancient, it was Gregory the Great who actually talked about the penalty for backbiting is blindness in examining oneself. And this idea that backbiting is when you're blaming others, criticizing them behind their back. And so that is even if it's not even vocalized, if we are blaming others, we become blind to seeing our own self. We lose the ability to have a true picture of our own self. And so he actually, I think, compared it to dust, that when you detract others, criticize others, even if it's just, even if it's true, still it's like blowing into a pile of dust, and it gets in your own eyes. And then you do lose your ability to see the truth. in my experience, if, sometimes I think it's a great practice at the end of the day to look back and see what could I have done better today? What can I do, make a resolution to do better tomorrow? And so, what went well, what didn't go well, what can go better tomorrow? Well, if I can't see anything that didn't go well, I would almost get scared. Like, oh, have I been criticizing people today? Like, have I been inwardly critical of others? Because I know that when we get critical of other people, we just don't see how we ourselves can grow.
That's fascinating. So, Kevin, I think also so Jocko is talking about extreme ownership in the context of business, and the example you gave was in a business context. Now, I think it should be pretty clear from what we've been talking about how it applies to just your own personal situation. And I mean, maybe the ultimate example would be you have to take extreme ownership kind of for your own happiness, your own life in a way. I'm wondering, have you ever used this in your practice in a therapy context? Have you used the concept of extreme ownership? And does that resonate with people in sort of taking ownership for their own kind of personal, say, problems?
It definitely fits with how I help people to locate what can they do to grow. And, my specialty is with people with anxiety. And many times people with anxiety are trying to control things that are actually outside of their control. So there is a letting go of controlling others and only trying to control what you can control, which is internally, can you be patient in accepting whatever you feel, so that patience guides everything on the inside, and then exteriorly, can you really shape your behavior according to your ideals and ultimately according to love and charity, so that really is how you shape everything that has to do with things outside of you. And so the idea that, I wanted my life to be defined by the ideals that I hold myself to. That, this is what I want my life to be about. It's about the ideals that I'm living. So I do think that actually is deeply embedded, these ideas, in acceptance and commitment therapy itself. That you have to be able to accept your emotions, but then commit to the highest kind of action. And in a way, when Leif is asking Gary to own the problem, it's like saying, okay, yes, you have your emotions, great. But then what are we going to do that really is helping the most people, that would actually build your bond with the superintendent? So focusing on the bond actually was exactly doing this. Yeah, you can admit that, okay, yeah, my ego is getting bruised here, but I'm going to do the right thing, and I take ownership and commit to building this bond. So I see these things all as they all fit together very well.
Mm-hmm. Now, Kevin, I think we have a lot of optimal work members, users, listeners who are students, and I know you were at one point a student. So maybe just to apply it for students briefly, because I know that a lot of times students, if they're in a class where they feel, okay, they don't connect with the teacher or the professor as well, they don't think they're learning as much as they could be, they can have a little bit of a mindset like, well, this class is kind of a waste of time. Mm-hmm. And I think that phrase also, though, we were wasting our time. That's another indicator to me that there's a lack of ownership here. If you're in a meeting that's recurring that you think is a waste of time, well, you're clearly being a passive. But what do you do? I mean, maybe it's also similar with like a recurring meeting at work or something, or a student in a class that they don't think the lectures are valuable. Do you have any advice for what a student can do to take extreme ownership in that situation?
Yeah, so the temptation there, I think, is to blame the professor, to blame the class, or to blame the format. And as long as the student's doing that, they're not really able to change how well they're using this class. So extreme ownership would be very directly applied here. That it's understandable that you would have this the urge to blame others, but in this case, there's so much of your that if you own the opportunity for growth, you will see that it is deep and multifaceted. That if you start to really think about how you want to be shaping yourself, uh, you can use this class to shape yourself. So, okay, you want to be committed to deeper things. Well, then how could you use this class to grow in sincerity and really pursuing the good, to grow in generosity and serving it, to grow in order and intensity and constancy, which is going to allow you to grow in any way. So I think that in this case, that would be like a prime case of how to use it, because you only have yourself to be responsible for as a student. I think as a teacher also, if you're teaching others, if the students aren't doing well, you can't blame the students for not doing well. The teacher themselves would need to take responsibility and to say, what could I be? Yeah, it might be true that the students could work harder. Yes. But as a teacher, you have to take responsibility for the students too. The teacher in that circumstance is more the leader, and has to exercise leadership. Never blame the students for the lack of performance. No, you could have made clear what you were expecting. You could have had, you could have made the difficulty of a concept clearer to them so that they would really work on it, and so on. So I think I would focus on both student and the teacher in that circumstance.
Yeah. Yeah, Kevin, and I know, sorry, we have gone off now on a few tangents, so I want to get to some of the central ideas that you wanted to talk about in the last few minutes that we have here. One was decentralized command, which you mentioned very briefly, but I don't know if you wanted to go a little bit more into that.
Yeah, so it has to do with, can you have too much extreme ownership? And the answer is yes. And this is where it has to be nuanced a little bit. And so maybe the best way of explaining it is decentralized command could be thought of as decentralized ownership, where you're helping each person on the team to have a sense of responsibility. That's definitely the best way to be operating. So interesting that Jocko Willink does not like the idea of accountability. He said you shouldn't have to hold your team accountable. They should want to win at whatever you're doing so much that they hold themselves to the highest standards. So they are living this ownership already. You don't have to be following up on them. And it's like if you, he said the most extreme case of accountability would be that Jocko, go to your house and wake you up in the morning and then lead you through a morning routine and get you started. He's like, do you think that would actually produce better results than someone deeply wanting to grow, deeply owning the mission themselves and preparing themselves for it? He said, no, absolutely. That intrinsic motivation is always going to be more powerful. So accountability is never the best option. And leaders never want to rely on accountability. Instead, you try to make sure every person feels free and responsible for their own part. And if you're not getting the results that you would want, then how do you deepen that sense of responsibility in the team members? You have to get them more committed freely to the mission. You can't just try to hold them accountable or use shame. Now, all of that is exactly right. So he also says, interestingly, that before a big event, like so there's going to be some presentation in a company or a battle in Ramadi, you want decentralized command is the key, that everyone feels responsible. But then, depending on the outcome, if the outcome is a success, then the leader lets the team get all the credit and doesn't try to take any for him or herself. But if it's a failure, then the leader takes responsibility fully for the failure and doesn't share it with the others. I think that's actually a very beautiful and generous way of trying that the leader has the most responsibility for the common good the team is pursuing. And so he or she has to be the one to take responsibility if it doesn't go well, because there are some things that they could have done better. And in fact, the more the leader takes responsibility, even in failure, the more the entire team will follow. The leader is giving an example of being humble, which means always growing in self-knowledge, trying to, even when you do that, recognize the good that others are contributing and really modeling a willingness to learn, especially from failure.
Well, Kevin, I think that's a good note for us to end on. And you kind of hinted at this thing of humble leadership, which maybe we can dive into more detail in a future episode.
That sounds great.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks so much, Kevin.
Thanks a lot, Sharif.
All right, we'll be back next week.
Until next time.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. If you enjoyed our conversation and you're looking for more in-depth guidance, check out optimwork.com, our unique platform that delivers content, tools, and exercises to help you thrive at work and beyond.